7. The emotional logic of global teams. Every organization has two systems running at once. The first is visible: processes, reporting structures, workflows, KPIs, escalation pathways. This is the formal architecture, the part leaders spend most of their time refining, documenting, and aligning. The second system is invisible: emotion, instinct, fear, trust, hierarchy, cultural conditioning. This is the emotional architecture the part leaders assume will take care of itself as long as the processes are clear. But in global organizations, the emotional architecture is not a background system. It is the system. The formal structure may tell people what they should do, but it is the emotional system that shapes what they actually do. Behavior is not led by instruction, it is led by emotional interpretation. Understanding this reality requires a shift in how we think about global communication. It means recognizing that when people respond to a message, they are not responding only to words, they are responding to how those words make them feel, what they mean in their cultural context, and how they interact with their internal emotional logic. This emotional logic is not random. It is learned and reinforced over years through education, family environment, societal expectations, hierarchy norms, and previous workplace cultures. It becomes the internal compass through which people navigate risk, collaboration, conflict, ambiguity, and leadership. A leader once described it this way: "I used to think people reacted differently because they disagreed. Now I understand they reacted differently because they were interpreting the world differently." The moment she saw this, her entire leadership approach changed. To illustrate emotional logic, I often describe a global team facing a simple question: do we move now or do we wait for more clarity? This single question reveals the organization's emotional geography. Some teams move immediately because initiative feels safe and delay feels dangerous. Others wait because certainty feels safe and premature action feels risky. Still others discuss collectively because harmony feels safe and unilateral decisions feel threatening. The logic behind each choice is emotional, not rational. And it is this emotional logic, not competency, not technical skill, not understanding of the content, that shapes how global teams behave. One of the most vivid examples of emotional logic emerged during a leadership program with a multinational engineering firm. Their teams were asked to assess a theoretical quality concern and decide at what point they would escalate. Participants were placed in mixed groups and given the same scenario. What happened next was striking. The American participants escalated early, believing that transparency and speed were signs of professionalism. The German participants escalated slightly later, waiting until the issue was clear enough to be factual. The British participants escalated once they had consulted each other internally. The Japanese participants escalated only after confirming no local resolution was possible. The Brazilian participants escalated early, but to colleagues, not upward, believing relational alignment was the first priority. Each group could explain their reasoning perfectly. None of them had misunderstood the scenario. What differed was the emotional calculation beneath their reasoning. Each team was trying to minimize risk. They simply defined risk differently. This emotional logic, invisible, inherited, deeply rooted, is the source of most global misalignment. To lead effectively across borders, leaders must understand these emotional patterns not as quirks or obstacles but as the internal structure of the organization. Emotional logic is a map. When leaders learn to read it, they can predict drift before it happens. One senior leader told me that once she understood the emotional logic behind her team's decisions, she began to see patterns everywhere. A region that hesitated before asking questions was not disengaged, it was culturally conditioned to avoid appearing uninformed. A team that escalated frequently was not panicking, it was trying to show accountability. A team that interpreted silence as disapproval was not insecure, it was used to environments where leaders rarely spoke unless something was wrong. When she stopped treating these behaviors as performance issues and started seeing them as emotional responses, her frustration evaporated. It was as if, she said, I suddenly understood the language beneath the language. This is what emotional logic offers leaders, the ability to see meaning where previously they only saw behavior. Another example came from a technology company where leaders struggled to understand why certain teams were slow to challenge decisions, even when they had good reason. The leadership assumed the teams were unconfident or overly deferential. But the teams themselves believed they were being respectful. In their emotional logic, challenging too early risked creating conflict or friction. They waited for the appropriate moment, which in their culture arrived far later than in others. Meanwhile, their more direct colleagues interpreted the hesitation as lack of engagement. Two emotional logics collided, each misreading the other. And the leader, who assumed the message was clear, could not understand why behavior was so inconsistent. Emotional logic also influences how people interpret leadership pressure. For some, pressure activates a desire to act quickly, decisively, and visibly. For others, pressure activates caution or withdrawal. For still others, pressure creates a need for consensus. These responses have nothing to do with capability and everything to do with the emotional frameworks people rely on when the stakes feel high. Leaders often imagine that crisis brings out the best in teams, the shared purpose, the unity, the commitment. But in global organizations, crisis brings out the most deeply ingrained emotional instincts. This is not a flaw. It is a feature of human behavior. Under pressure, people return to what has kept them safe in the past. Understanding these instincts is not about labeling cultures or categorizing individuals. It is about recognizing that global organizations operate according to emotional ecosystems. When leaders begin to see their teams in this way, as networks of emotional logic rather than clusters of tasks and functions, they can begin to stabilize the system rather than reacting to its symptoms. One of the most profound insights leaders gain through the MC3 method is that emotional logic is not the enemy of alignment. Unrecognized emotional logic is. When emotional patterns remain invisible, they create drift. But when leaders understand them, they can anticipate how messages will land, where misunderstandings may arise, and which parts of the organization will require more emotional clarity rather than more operational detail. The emotional logic of global teams is not a barrier between cultures. It is the connective tissue that allows diverse teams to operate together when leaders understand it. And once they do, they begin to see that emotional stability is not a soft skill. It is a structural requirement for consistent global execution. In the next chapter, we explore what happens when pressure magnifies these emotional patterns, when small interpretive differences grow into powerful forces that reshape behavior during moments of strain. This is the crisis amplification effect, where global alignment is tested not by strategy but by emotion.